it's it's a dual presentation. So our talks are connected. Really, we're really talking about the concept that we've developed, not alone, but together. Caroline introducing some very important innovations to the idea that we've been working on for a few years. This idea of basic income plus, and so I've got some slides, and I'm going to talk through those ideas. We actually thought we were working to a much fiercer timescale than we've been granted. So I don't know whether it's a good thing to give us more time than we planned having, but hopefully we'll use that time wisely. And I will say a little bit about myself. So I run something called Citizen Network, which is a global cooperative whose purpose is to advance citizenship for all. We believe everyone's different, and that's a good thing, and everyone is absolutely equal, which you might think is paradoxical, but we don't. And one of the things that I've been involved in is founding the UBI Lab network, which started in Sheffield, which is the city I live in, along with some friends here in Sheffield. One element of that network is UBI Lab Disability, which is actually organised as what's called a disabled people's organisation. So the authority to make decisions about what that group does and what it says and believes lies with the disabled people in the group. I'm not technically a disabled person, I think, by the standard definitions. But I have spent a lot of my life working in partnership with disabled people, with families, with people particularly with learning difficulties, or in the US and Canada, they say people with intellectual disabilities. And I spent quite a lot of my life focused on how to get the money that was locked in services into the hands of the people who those services were for, but sometimes who didn't really benefit from those services because they're organized in the wrong way. So my interest is a lot to do with the way money and power intersect. And of course, that basic income is a similar type of issue, where what I think it's about is really kind of economic empowerment to enable equal citizenship, to enable everyone to turn up in the community as an equal and to give the best of themselves and to be able to make the best of themselves and to support each other. So basic income isn't the goal. Citizenship and equality is the goal for me, but basic income is a really important tool in that. So I'm going to share these slides, hopefully. Yep. So hopefully people can see that. So the plan is I'm going to talk about, in a way, the problem we're trying to solve, the question of simplicity versus sufficiency, some of the issues that we can see playing out in disability communities, particularly in the UK, and the context in the UK today. So we really hope that this will be a very broad general issue. The deeper issues we're exploring will apply in any place where basic income is meant to function. But the examples we give and the context we provide will be from the UK benefit system. And Caroline, in her talk, is going to talk more about the specific approach that we are proposing, which she'll go into a little bit more detail. This isn't exactly the basic income Earth network definition. It's close enough, I think, for me not to be evicted. It's my take on what we mean by basic income, which is something which is fairly well defined, but there are slight kind of subtleties sometimes about how people define it. So I think it's fundamentally about a community saying to its members, right, we're going to make sure everybody here gets enough money to live on. And how we do that is that we give every single individual enough money to live on, and that we do that in a way that is, you get it individually and universally, whatever your family circumstance. So there's no assumption of a head of household having the responsibility to provide for the other members and the inherent dependency that involves. Universality also means no conditionality. So there's no assumption that you've got to follow particular rules or do particular things in order to get enough money to live on. Universality also means no means testing. So you get it whatever your income, whatever your savings. And again, this is not always in the standard definition, but my basic assumption is that basic income is a form of redistribution, and that primarily it will be paid for from taxes. That is a controversial point of view, and that we need to give people with extra needs extra income, and that's basically what the concept of a UBI plus means, or basic income plus means. It's thinking about this as something that has this kind of shape, so that everybody gets, if you like, the basic income, but some people get additional components on top. And in a way, if we look at some of the writings of leading advocates of basic income, great people like Guy Standing and Malcolm Torrey, there tends to be some discussion of this. But I suppose I don't want this to be like a severe criticism, but sometimes it feels a little bit like the issue of disability is put off to one side as, oh, well, of course, we need to also have these additional payments. Maybe sometimes it's represented as, oh, well, we need to just maintain the disability benefit system alongside the basic income system. And so effectively, it kind of sidesteps the problem, but I think that can also appear as if it's avoiding the problem. And in the context of the UK benefit system, that's a rather major problem, because some disability benefits, particularly what's now called the employment and support allowance, which used to be called the incapacity benefit, really already contain the basic income element. They're not an additional payment, they are the core income payment, although they're meant to be slightly more generous than the lower benefits that are given to non-disabled people. So you can see that if you start talking about reforming the benefit system, but then don't engage with the issue of disability benefits, you can quite quickly get yourselves in a little bit of trouble, I think. And I mean, my view is this is where some of the fear and anger has come from some members of the disability community. It's important not to generalize too much. Obviously, UBI Lab Disability has many people with disabilities in it. There are many advocates of basic income who are disabled people. But there is an important group of disability advocates, certainly in the UK, but also in Canada, I believe, who are very suspicious of the idea of basic income. And this paper that I'm citing here, which was authored by, I think Ellen Clifford was the lead author, because the paper is largely like something she published previously. But if you look at some of the arguments, they're important arguments. I mean, I think that they are somewhat fallacious, but they express genuine fears that are not without importance. And I mean, the first of those is that, again, a basic income would be just too low, and it would certainly be inadequate for people with extra needs. And again, you can see how, you know, when some advocates of basic income have been arguing for a small basic income as a starter, not to replace the benefit system, but you can see how that might also trigger people's fears that, well, hang on, if we start to do this, will it undermine the benefit system and commitment to the benefit system? There's also a grave concern from some people, and not just in the disability community, that basic income, as it were, will require a redistribution away from public services. And that's where also we see the kind of arguments around universal basic services versus universal basic income playing out. This fear that in a way there's a choice that has to be made between giving people enough money and giving people free public services. There's also a kind of fear that just any change like this, anything that makes the system more universal, in a sense, will have to involve some redistribution away from people who have extra needs, disabled people and others. There's another fear that's expressed, which again is a really important one to think about, because many of the disability advocates, certainly in the UK, have been very focused, quite rightly, on ensuring that disabled people can access paid employment. That some of the reforms, in inverted commas, to the UK benefit system have been explicitly carried out with in the view that these will lead to more disabled people in work, and that's been their main justification. So a philosophy of basic income, which certainly, and I'm amongst those people who say we need to start reassessing paid work and not giving overwhelming value to paid work in society. I think it's understandable that some disabled people might think, but hang on a second, you're just in danger of closing the door even more on something that we want access to. Don't make it harder for us to get paid work by just now assuming that not everybody needs to be in paid work. It's the status of being in paid work that's important to us, as well as the economic resources that go with it. And finally, I think there's a fear that I put here perhaps rather simplistically, is you cannot trust neoliberal governments with income security. You need a socialist economy, or you need a very different kind of approach to economics and society and well-being. I mean, personally, I'm very sympathetic to this argument, but it seems to me that if you want to attack neoliberal governments, then you need to do it with concrete ideas, which includes basic income. So for me, on this kind of argument would be a little bit like a reason not to have a national health service. It would be a reason not to have all sorts of social benefits that we have managed to pull off over the years. So I don't think it's essentially a good argument, but it draws attention to an important point, which is that any idea can be implemented badly. And we do live, certainly in the UK, in one of the most extreme right-wing governments in the Western world. So what is the UK context? I mean, again, these fears, again, they're not just in the UK, but in the UK, I think these fears are amplified by the context we're in. What we're seeing is that over time, real benefit levels are falling, and actually taxes on people on lower incomes are increasing. So the redistribution of resources from the rich to the poor is collapsing. I'll show you some slides about that later. We've seen an enormous growth in kind of stigma, legitimizing of sanctions, the kind of skiver rhetoric, which has seen, it's made it very easy for governments, not just the recent Conservative governments, but the previous New Labour government, to make changes to the benefit system that have been very negative, particularly for disabled people, but not just for disabled people. Interestingly, however, when you look at the detail of the UK benefit system, some benefits that currently are in play are quite close to forms of basic income, whilst other parts of the system are like the polar opposite of forms of basic income. So it's interesting to look at the system, because you actually start to see that there are things we could build on to take us in the right direction, just as there are things we need to remove to take us in the right direction. In all of this, disabled people have been, I mean, I'd say an explicit target for welfare reforms, but all the time the justification has always been done in terms of the government saying this is for the benefit of disabled people. Yet at the same time, the Skyver rhetoric has often actually been used in a way which has been very damaging to disabled people. And we've seen, for instance, in the UK, an increase in hate crime that corresponds exactly to stigma and rhetoric that we see played out in newspapers, words expressed by leading politicians, which then cause people to be suspicious of disabled people, assuming that they're making up their disabilities, assuming that in some way that they're stealing resources from the common good. All of this is absolutely outrageous, false and cruel, but it's a real thing going on in the UK today. And this is despite the fact that the UK has been subject to severe criticism by the United Nations for its, well, say, so-called reforms. I mean, this slide here is just to show that all discussion of benefits and the costs of benefits and the cost of basic income, actually in this context, is very confusing, because we always refer to the gross cost. So the government will talk about the 200+ billion pounds spent on benefits, as if this is some act of great generosity by the state towards people on lower incomes. But actually, benefits are distributed across all deciles, across people of all income levels, extraordinarily, but that's the case. And taxes hit all groups, and actually the taxes as a percentage of income on the poorest are greater than on other groups. So what we see, in fact, is something that you could say is the real cost of the benefit system is its net cost, which is the gross cost, the formal 200 billion, minus all the taxes that people pay that come out of those benefits. And what we see then is that a much, much smaller figure. This is, I think the last time I did this data was the 2019 analysis. So I do this now and again. But you can see that actually the redistributory effect of our benefit system, which seems to be so expensive, is actually negligible. And it's been falling for all of the last 12 years. Where I probably for longer, but that's just in terms of the data I've been looking at. So we've got a system that on the face of it looks very expensive, but in reality is actually doing very little work. So this is another way of looking at it. If you look at the data today, it looks like that the richest 70% of the UK population are transferring to the poorest 30%. 90p per person per day, so a third of the price of a cup of coffee. A moderately expensive cup of coffee, I guess. But well, coffee always seems extraordinarily expensive, doesn't it? This is the UK benefit system. As you can see, the biggest expenditure actually is on a universal benefit, with some caveats. It is the state pension. Half of the benefit bill is the state pension. Obviously, that's just for people of pension age, and there are some requirements about national insurance, and there is some family dependency in there. So two individuals get more than a couple, for instance. But nevertheless, in many regards, there's no real conditionality, there's no real stigma. And actually, this is the bit of the benefit system that's been most well protected. In the UK, we call this the triple lock, which is that the system keeps growing in line with the economy, and it's not allowed to fall away and become of less value economically, unlike all the other benefits. But you can see that actually, and this is why this discussion I think is so important, disability benefits are a huge component of the rest of the benefit bill. So And if even more, if you add in the fact that many disabled people are also benefiting from housing benefits. So in the UK, so we've got disability costs, which is something called the DLA, and we've got the employment support allowance, and also other benefits that people can receive. So it's a very significant segment of the overall benefit bill goes towards disabled people. And this is just this is kind of, a questionable analysis, I suppose. But if you look at the UK benefit system, I certainly think if you look at the pension and what's called personal independence payment, the money that's just for disability benefit as an additional payment, it's not the income security element, it's for additional costs, and child benefit, those three benefits are quite basic income-ish. They do go to individuals. There is no conditionality. There is no real means testing. So they're very close to being forms of basic income. But if you look at something like job seekers allowance, for instance, which is the money that goes to people who, and employment support allowance to a degree, again, it's a slightly more complex benefit. There's a high degree of sanctions and stigma. There's a high degree of means testing. There's a high degree of family dependency built in. You don't qualify if you've got somebody in your household who's earning more than a certain level. So that's we've got this kind of chalk and cheesy benefit system at the moment, but there are things we can work on in this system. This slide just gives you a feeling, if you're not familiar. Sadly, I think people like Rona and Caroline and perhaps some other members of the audience will recognise that the UK has been through some vicious austerity cuts. Again, many of these things go under this rubric of welfare reform, but none of these things are improvements. They don't qualify as reforms. They're making the system worse. And it's been disabled people who've been at the centre of so many of these cuts, sometimes very explicitly, as in attempts to cut the employment support allowance bill, the incapacity benefits bill, sometimes more subtly, things like the increases in VAT, which have had more impact on people on lower incomes, and disabled people tend to be people on lower incomes. Housing benefit cuts similarly. For the housing benefit changes have been one of the most severe and damaging elements of all of this, but again, doesn't tend to get talked about. Cuts in council tax benefit also very, very regressive and very, very damaging to disabled people. So you can imagine, if you're not familiar with this, but this is the context in the UK, you can see why when people start talking about, oh, well, the answer is basic income, that many disabled people are kind of going, well, you've made promises before about positive reforms. We don't trust you. And that is the context, I think. The fundamental shape of the kind of employment support allowance, the standard disability benefit for income security in the UK has this kind of shape. There is this element to it, which is an extra kind of bit of viciousness, really, which is this attempt in the UK, we call it the work capability assessment, the attempt to find out whether you can really work or not, with all the time the suspicion that you might actually be able to work, but you're pretending that you can't so that you can qualify for some slightly high level of a benefit. The whole stigma and the structure of the stigma and the structure of this kind of myth that disabled people are somehow making up their disability, pretending or exaggerating in order to qualify for extra funding, has legitimized a lot of the very negative changes in the UK benefit system. These have seen things like a privatized disability assessment system, the work capability assessment here. In this research that we did with some partners, you can see that the assessment itself was causing people severe damage. And at the moment we're doing in partnership with Channel 4, we have a survey out which is testing what we suspect to believe to be the case, and other data supports, is that levels of suicide and mental illness have radically increased because of this kind of very severe damaging assessment. When you get to the other side of the system, and the system, unless there is a group of people who are deemed to be so far away from work that they're kind of left alone. But if you are deemed to have only a kind of moderate level of disability and you should still be working, then you can be subject to various kind of government initiatives to help you into work. These things have changed a wee bit, but we did some research led by Catherine Hale and working with Mind, looking here at the impact of the government's work programme, which people saying actually it made their health worse, it reduced their confidence about their ability to work, it damaged their sense of purpose in life. I shouldn't laugh, but it is amazing how negative these so-called reforms are. And sadly, though, there's no real accountability for these failed programs. This is from a paper by one of the Anna-Karin Fagerlind-Stahl. Actually, this paper came out of a paper she gave in Tampere at the BN conference, and we published, looking at how, if we actually have lots of evidence, Anna-Karin argues, from occupational health about what helps people flourish. This whole idea that work is good for you, Anna-Karin argues, is really a confused argument. What we know is that good work is good for you and bad work is bad for you. And we know some of the factors that make for good work, and they're to do with development, about relationships, about getting suitable rewards. And so in this model here, she's saying, if we look at the kind of the context that is good for human flourishing, we can see that the kind of benefit system that the UK government has been working towards, with conditionality, with control, with punishment, with very, very low income levels, is going to obviously have a very damaging impact on people's health. And that actually basic income does the opposite. It creates a basis for better health for all people, but also for people with disabilities. This is just a statement from, there have been many UN committee reports on the UK's breach of human rights, and this is just one of them. But you can see, very severe, and again, very little coverage of this in the UK press. So what are the benefits of Basic Income Plus? Well, one of the things that I think the disability community should think about is that actually a universal system, even if it's a universal system which has a bit of extra complexity, what Caroline will describe are these Boltons, if it's universal, then everybody has a stake in that system. So that's like our National Health Service. Even the rich get the benefit of getting the basic income. Even if we, which I think needs to happen, see their overall income drop, they will still see as part of their income the basic income element, and that will be secured in a way that's completely different to their other forms of income. So a universal system like a National Health Service and like universal basic income seems to me to have, with a good reason to think that it's something that people have a much greater commitment to securing. And again, we see that actually playing out in the state pension in the UK. So we can see examples of how this works already. There would be a huge benefit, I think, for disabled people from a UBI plus approach, because we would get rid of all of the workfare, the harmful training, the cruel sanctions, again, many of which particularly target disabled people, particularly people with mental health problems, have been very, very severely harmed by the sanction programs. Go on and on about this. Paradoxically, of course, basic income plus delivers actually better incentives to work, better economic incentives to work, because you can keep a higher percentage of your income, and you don't lose income if you try to work or you volunteer. At the moment, actually, people often find that they can't volunteer, because if they were volunteering, the system would say, it looks like you really can work, so we'll take your disability benefits off you. In fact, we'll take all of your income off you. You've got to go out and work because you were volunteering at a local library or a local creche, or you were contributing some other way to your community. So this is, I think, damaging society in a very extreme way, just removing people's ability to contribute to their community from them, because it's deemed as something that could be commodified as paid work. But also we see the improvement of, instead of had kind of 100%, or I think in the UK now with universal credit, they can get it down to 70% tax on marginal earnings. We can get that down to about 40% with basic income plus, i.e. everybody just starts paying tax at the same level, at a moderate level, when they've start to earn, with the floor of all of the basic income guaranteed by the community. People would be able to save money, buy assets. Again, there's a complex debate there, but I think in general, that's a good thing. And they'd also be able to fall in love, live together, get married without suffering a major loss. There'd be enough for people to live on if they wanted to be single, but they wouldn't see the kind of severe cuts in income or rights that happen when people come together, which is often a cause of so-called benefit fraud. It's one of the most common causes of benefit fraud, is when couples come together but don't tell the DWP that they've come together. It kind of seems extraordinary to me that that's a part of ordinary life now, that people are expected to be reporting on a kind of weekly basis on the status of their relationship to a government department that doesn't trust them. And of course, the stigma of benefits makes no sense if we're all on benefits. So these are the kind of arguments I think that we can present in contradiction to the kind of fears, the worst fears that some people have about basic income. And so the paper that Caroline's going to talk about is available. I think I've uploaded it to the Hoover site. I'll stop sharing for a minute, and I can put the last few slides up. Well, I also have a little problem here. There we go. Yeah, so we've put the paper up and some other papers on the Hoover site if people want to download them. They're also available on the Citizen Network website as well. That's enough from me, I think. Caroline, do you want to come in, and do you want me to stick up these slides for you as we go, and then we'll take questions, or have our break and then take questions? All right.
Yep, that's great. Thank you very much, Simon. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm a disabled activist, and I've known Simon for quite a few years. And for probably about the last 12 to 15 years, I've been looking at the welfare and social security support in the UK. And it's sort of complicated and convoluted system, the way it's been built. And it's a patchwork system. It was a patchwork system at one point of around 84 different benefits, complete with loopholes and withdrawal rates. And when they introduced universal credit, which is one of our major payments now, and that has a very punitive system overwritten over it. It has a lot of compulsion in it that's attached to income. And so I've constantly been looking at how to reform the system, and how reform of this system has to include all the additional needs that we keep coming across various demographics, not just for disabled people or people who are chronically ill, People who are chronically ill, I'll just highlight this, tend to be included with disabled people because the level of their illness is in itself disabling. So I may use the two terms or may use one or the other, and they're fairly interchangeable for the majority of people. There are people whose disability is stable and they are able as well. The Paralympics coming up, so you will see a lot of people who are stable and able in their disability, but a vast number of people are disabled by being chronically ill, or the disability that they have makes them ill. And they are a huge group. They're the bigger subset. Talking about UBI, it came to me that there seemed to be two arguments. One would be get a UBI, just let's achieve this UBI. And even if it's a small amount. And the other one is a more real world idea about UBI, where it says it has to reach a minimum income standard, an MIS. I'm sure everyone's aware of this. And that, as Simon touched on, raises queries and fears. A UBI that is low, there is the fear amongst people who get means tested benefits, which is the majority of our benefits now are means tested, that the means tested benefits, if there's the UBI is very low, £20, £30, £40, it may be counted as income and removed from those means tested benefits. So that's a real fear in communities that are relying on state support. And the other problem is the idea of a minimum income standard, because a lot of minimum income standards are being created that have no variance. They basically say, what's the minimum a person needs to live on? And someone will say, oh, well, it's £200 or $250 or whatever the sum they come to. And that's treating everybody as being exactly the same, and that the minimum income to cover their needs is identical. And that's quite a huge flaw in the argument, because the minimum income that people need is very variable depending on that person. So we can't, I don't personally feel that we can say, okay, well, the minimum income for everybody would be the same amount. It clearly wouldn't be the same amount when you have additional needs and additional costs associated to those additional needs. So some minimum income standards or some equal amounts that are being suggested penalise some groups and fail to meet the minimum income required for some groups in society. So given what I and Simon have outlined so far, I'm going to talk about our proposal of a what we call a UBI plus. We did have some conversation with people because obviously this is an international thing. So somebody else has used this phrase and it means a completely different thing to what we mean. So apologies if you were looking, if you came here looking for the other UBI plus, you're going to be disappointed. Our UBI Plus is a system that works on looking at households. In a way, it's similar to part of the system we already have, which we call universal credit. It's our latest benefit overhaul, I suppose, our new benefit system in the UK. It actually only covers, out of the 70 available benefits, it actually only covers 6 of them, but it covers 6 of the largest ones. Well, that's based on households. So what it does is it looks at your household, looks at how many adults are there, how many children are there, and literally gives you an amount for each one. It isn't very sophisticated, and it is incredibly low. It is so low, it's almost impossible for a lot of people to manage to survive on. It doesn't cover the needs. So we created a system where we do have a basic payment. We do say everybody gets this amount, but we recognize the add-ons that we call bolt-ons of things like people who are in unpaid work, people who are volunteers, who are carers. And this is important. If you're a carer, it takes you out of the workplace a lot of the time. A lot of people will understand if they've cared for a child, preschool age child, a young child, a child with disabilities, an adult with disabilities, or cared for aging parents, that this will take you away from the world of work for a period of time, which can be disruptive both financially and career-wise, has a huge impact on women and women's ability to be having to be part of two things at the same time and feeling like they fail one. And there are people who are distanced from work and disabled people who tend to face a lot of discrimination in the workplace. There's some degree of tokenism in some countries. That's literally enforced tokenism, where they say you have to have a certain percentage of the workforce so you can be the token disabled person, and they won't employ anybody else, won't look at anybody else because they've ticked that box, they've achieved what they need to achieve. I'm sure people have experienced other forms of discrimination will understand this. And people who are distanced from work in this way because chronic illness or disability, they have more long-term costs. So we have to be careful with the UBI that those people have long-term costs, basic things like wear and tear, white goods breaking down. I personally had a fridge break down one Christmas Eve and literally had no money to purchase a fridge. And it's those sort of things that if you can't go out and get a job to get this to replace items, which people who are able-bodied can do, a person who's disabled or chronically ill wouldn't be able to meet some of these very hidden long-term costs. And so if we have a UBI that's based on a minimum income standard, it genuinely has to cover needs, not in a very superficial way. It actually has to look closely at what people need. This is going to vary because, again, this is an international event, so it's going to vary considerably from country to country across the whole globe. It's going to be very, very variable. In the UK, we have the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and they regularly do a basket of needs. Other organisations do these as well. And these actually asked people for their own demographic, for their own group, what they identify as their needs. These have changed over time. There's been strange add-ons like mobile phones, and oh, please excuse my dog. Mobile phones are now classed as an essential across pretty much all groups that respond to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation had looked at a whole raft, or rather the people who submitted, who worked on these groups, saying what they needed for their organisation, their demographic rather. So, you know, basic things, food and clothing and bills that you have to pay, water rates, council tax, house insurances, stuff like that. Fuel costs, fuel, gas, electricity, motoring, travel costs, social participation costs. These are all really essential in a functioning society, that you have enough to cover this. And there's one thing that Simon has said before about simple shouldn't override sufficient. So in a desperate attempt to simplify things, sometimes we cut away at the sufficient. And I feel that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and other organisations that do these baskets of need really do dig deep into the sufficient, what it is we all need. And they still fall into groups. People think, oh, well, that's too much because everybody's really different. But they're not. I mean, we can have single adults, we can have couples, we can have lone parents, we can have couples with children, we can have retired people. They still fall into groups where their needs can be very similar and also can be calculated. So I looked at the Joseph Rowntree stuff, and I looked at the stuff that I felt that I did subtract some stuff. I subtracted stuff that I felt society wouldn't account for, and that was things like alcohol and holidays. And in a basket of goods, it's perfectly acceptable to have things like eating out, going for a drink, going on holiday. All is very acceptable, very normal. However, would that fit in with what society sees as acceptable? Bearing in mind that society still has this problem of, we're giving people money to sit on their sofas and watch TV. We're not going to give them money to go for a drink. We're not going to give them money to go on holiday. So we do butt up against what Simon talked about, which is the stigma and the idea that some people are giving and other people are receiving, and that that's a static situation. It's always the same people and it's for all of their lives. We all see that that's a really false argument, but it's one that has a powerful motivating effect in some sectors of society. So I narrowed this down to being things for the person, things for the home, and things for outside of the home. So things for the person are essentially food and clothing. And again, in other places, then there may be food, clothing, there may be other things that are essential, like insurances for medical treatment. So that would alter it for each, wherever you are, whatever the essential need is to keep a person alive. So food and clothing. Then there's, how do I run a household? And if you're looking at a household, you have things like water rates. In the UK, we have council tax, there's household insurances, and there are other housing costs, household goods. There's the internet and a phone that's now become an essential in a basket. So the house itself costs everybody money. Then you've got to heat it, obviously, that's another core essential. Outside of the home, there's things like motoring and travel costs. People often feel that if they take work, that because of the costs of going to work, that they're not going to be that much better off, and they're working for pennies an hour, because not only have they had income deducted from benefits and taxation, they've also got increased costs. So I factored in either a motoring or travel cost, whichever feels most appropriate. And this is actually quite high. It feels quite high, but that is because in the UK, in most areas, it is very expensive to use things like public transport and motoring costs. I know in other countries it's much cheaper, but in the UK, that's a significant barrier to people moving back into the workplace. And this is one of the barriers that our government refuses to look at. And they're saying, you know, even any work is better than no work. And it really isn't. If the costs of going to work and the withdrawal rates put you in a worse position. And a lot of people find themselves in that position. Excuse me. There's also something that I call a social and cultural participation amount included in my figures. And I think this is really important. This is where people can take children to events, museums, holidays, and everyone needs to have this social and cultural opportunity. And poverty denies you that. Poverty denies you those days out. Poverty denies you the ability to go to a town or a city and to go to a museum, because that would swallow up an inordinate amount of your benefits. You simply can't afford to do it if you're on the very basic benefits in the UK. This means, you know, this is really unfair. This is putting people firmly in their box and not allowing them any form of luxury at all whatsoever. Obviously, with the universal basic income, no one's telling you how to spend the money. But if we create it in a way that allows people to imagine themselves how they want to spend their money, a lot of people will benefit from that. Children will benefit from that. The idea that children should be in clubs and have experiences that other children have is a great equalizer. No child should grow up feeling that they missed out because they were poor. And there's an awful lot of adults will say that that's how they feel. And this is terrible. This is where we get into generational poverty, because it's not just poverty of money, it's poverty of opportunity, it's poverty of experience, and that leads to poverty of aspiration. Our children cannot aspire if their minds haven't been opened by having these experiences. So I'm going to come on now, and I won't over focus on the disability element, but I will talk about how we could arrange, quiet dog, how we could arrange this.
5 minutes.
So, having talked briefly about how much money people should get for certain things, that becomes our universal basic income. Households then get a housing amount, so that becomes a single payment. And then there's what we call Boltons. And these Boltons are for things like unable to work. And if you raise the level of the UBI, then the unable to work Bolton does not have to be as big. And therefore, you're not drawing people in by offering an addition that is huge. It's much less, because everyone's better off. All this unable to work bolt-on does effectively is cover the costs of the long-term things that I spoke about, the fact that you've got to have your heating on more because you're at home more, the fact that that goods wear out. So a bolt-on of a relatively small amount of around £65 a week, perhaps, or £85 a week, would be enough to recognise that difference and to compensate for the loss of income over time. One of the other important things is to recognise the role of people who are carers. And when you're caring, you're not working. And if you're not working, you don't have an income, you are in poverty, and you have your choices reduced. So another bolt-on would be this carers allowance, which would be in the region of around £130, which is twice what the government currently pays for a carers allowance. Of course, there would still be disability premiums, and as Simon said, there would be the universal disability benefits, which stand outside. So there's absolutely no need to cost for those things. And yeah, it's literally, this is how it's set up. A household costs a certain amount of money, and people have a certain value of needs. And as long as you have those two things, you're not creating differentials. You're actually paying for a house, paying for the bills, which is a shared responsibility within any household. Is everyone's using these utilities, and they need to be paid for. Well, they only need to be paid for once. And then there's all the personal stuff. That's personal to each person. So that becomes a separate payment, even though they can be combined and paid to simply one person. So one person would get their own personal allowance part of it, and they would get their own household part of it, and another person living in the house wouldn't get the household part of it. So there's no duplication of paying for the cost of the house. So I'm getting a wrap up now from Rona, and I'll happily wrap up and say I've probably raised more questions than I've given you answers. So I'll happily see you in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Simon and Caroline, for those wonderful sort of inspiring talks about our current system, which I have to say, this is my own personal opinion. When our social security system was invented in the 1940s, it was called social security. I emphasize the word security. It is now called benefits. If you look at the dictionary term benefit, it means a gift, a perk, largesse. It is the largesse of the state that it's bestowing upon us grateful disabled people and other people who, for some reason, require additional financial support. I think that benefits should be called social security entitlements. That's just my personal opinion. I think benefits is a misnomer. But thank you very, very much. We do have some questions. I'm just looking at our first question here. Exit full screen. Why is that not happening? Our first question is, to what extent is the private sector and its target mentality involved in the assessment and service of disabilities? Why can't these be public services? This is a question from John Carlisle. So I'll go to Caroline first.
Why can't they be? Well, they were. Assessments were in-house. We had the DWP had their own medical advisors, and they kicked in when there was more query of the medical status of somebody. So they had their own in-house doctors effectively. There was some problems with that system, and unfortunately it almost feels like they took a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. There were some small problems as you get in any system, but they wanted to eradicate this close connection of the benefit system and medical advisors within it. That's almost the truth, because I think we realized that the real truth is there was a campaign of reducing the cost of benefits, and instead of these doctors being very vulnerable, the doctors who worked for the Department of Work and Pensions, instead of them being very vulnerable, and the DWP saying, we're going to slash benefits, we're going to increase criteria, and we want you as doctors to support it, they took the whole thing away and gave it to these anonymous people who can't be harmed. And it was this idea that the market will provide a better service. It hasn't done. neither has it provided a
Thank
good
you.
service.
So, do you have anything to add to that?
Me, I think that one of the things is that there was a very intentional plan to use private providers and to use incentives for those private providers to push the assessments in the direction that government wanted them. But I mean, putting all the blame on the private sector, of course, is slightly problematic when it is the state itself that is behind this. So I suppose it raises quite profound questions about, so like the privatization aspect of it seems to me somewhat problematic, but it's more what were the malign intentions of the civil servants and ministers that drove the policy, because it was them that set the targets for the private providers. The only thing I would add really is that I've always felt that the key issue here is the existence of the DWP itself. And I actually think it's right. The issue of stigma and shame is wrapped up with the existence of the Department of Work and Pensions, the department for, just as exactly as Rona's already described, for benefits, but used to be Social Security. And really, these things should just be all part of the tax system. And if they were part of the tax system, the kind of reforms that Caroline's outlined would then be actually delivered in the same spirit, I think, as the self-assessment system. I mean, although I'm on quite a modest income, I've avoided the benefit system, but I'm still subject to the self-assessment system. Every year, I have to tell the government a few basic things about my situation. It's assumed that I'm telling the truth, but there are checks and balances in place to make sure that I'm not lying. What's curious is that that system isn't a universal system. We have a special system for people on low incomes and people with disabilities, which is much more punitive and assumes people are lying. So kind of one of my strategies, in a sense, is to say, well, let's actually just eliminate the source of the problem, which is the DWP itself, and actually just roll this all into a universal approach, which is much more based on trust and the assumption that citizens generally tell the truth, but is not naive, and that needs to be designed so that people, we can spot people who are not telling the truth, particularly the wealthy, who are the most likely, most incentivized to lie anyway, because they've got something to hide.
Thank you. We do have one more question, time for one more question, sorry, from Timothy Carter. Please describe how you would include these bolt-ons based on quote-unquote disability while still eliminating the horrors associated with assessment. Either of you?
I'll let Caroline build on this further, but I mean, in a way, that's actually where I was going with what I just said, I suppose, Rona. I think that if we administratively unify this and make it a universal system, I mean, the rich and the middle class would never put up with being treated the way disabled people and people in poverty are treated. So like, we need to raise our standard to one which says people should be trusted. What the model Caroline outlines does include some simple, some slightly more sophisticated questions about, your life circumstances that can lead to increased payments. And in the case of disability, I think that's slightly more sophisticated again, but I think you can still actually assume that people would tell the truth about their situation. And if there was a question about it, then you could go to general practitioners, doctors, and double check those things. So that's the way I would approach it. I would assume that people are telling the truth. I would assume that we all have to kind of complete some kind of self-assessment on some kind of regular basis as citizens, and that you make that as kind of objective as you can and as simple as you can, but you build in some checks and balances.
Yeah, I've very little to add to what Simon said. The number of bolt-ons is actually quite small, and also easy to prove. It's fairly easy to prove if you're caring for a parent and you're not working, because obviously you're not working, you won't have any evidence of work or income. And similarly with childcare, the unable to work bolt-on, because it's been reduced in value, though the overall amount has increased that people will receive, and using Simon's idea of it's quite simple, you explain, and you can get a GP to back it up, your medical records will back it up. It shouldn't be this onerous task, but also by increasing the amount of money that people get within a social security or a UBI, you can decrease the amount of money for the long-term unemployed scenario of poverty and replacement of goods and having an adequate standard of living. So it's by decreasing that, it's not as attractive. And I think for people who aren't from the UK, and even people who are but aren't in the benefit system, they won't understand the what potentially the large difference in income that exists. And it isn't a large difference in income for most people who are working, but for people who are absolutely on the bottom levels, as I said when I opened, the amount that we give people under universal credit is so very, very low that there is the temptation for people to recognize that moving off a sickness benefit, a benefit for chronic illness, is a treacherous place to go. They've made it incredibly difficult to get, and therefore people become entrenched on it. If the amount is less, but the actual amount that you get is more, so you're reducing a differential, then that doesn't cause the same level of entrenchment. And if you also look at the idea of, well, it's more honest just to say, look, I'm too sick to work at the moment, this week, next week, the doctor says I'm not going to be working for the next 3 months, here's a sick note, and that just passports you straight into that small additional bolt-on. It also takes away that fear, because at the moment people entrench into benefits because they're terrified that if they leave, if they try something, if they have a change of circumstances, that they're then going to have great difficulty getting back into that benefit system. So I think this UBI and this bolt-on really reduces the idea of entrenchment in benefits.
Thank you very much. We have sadly come to the end of this discussion. So I want to apologise to people who have put questions into the chat that we didn't get around to answering. But as I said, you will be able to private message the speakers on Hoover and continue the discussion if you so wish to do so. I'd like to thank Simon and Caroline very much for taking part in this morning's conversation. And I hope that this has given our audience some insight into how we could actually turn basic income plus, UBI plus, into a reality for future generations of disabled people. I've been Rona Topaz, and thank you very much for coming this morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rona. Thank you, everyone.